My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to 106.7 Wilmington's Big Talker. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m. as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. Well, Super Tuesday, and with it the North Carolina primary elections, are behind us, almost. You might be celebrating the political demise of Michael Bloomberg, but for reasons we will discuss, I wouldn't celebrate just yet. Meanwhile, as you will see, March 3rd was a mixed bag for gun voters, with some victories, some losses, and one particularly important race not yet decided. Elsewhere, the left continues its attempts to intimidate the Supreme Court into making decisions in support of the leftist agenda. And in Virginia, the tens of thousands of gun rights supporters who recently rallied in Richmond be damned as Virginia Democrats continue sending gun control legislation to the governor's desk for, I would have to say, inevitable signature. But first, this just in gun rights news. For years, gun control advocates have dismissed your arguments that they are seeking the incremental end of private gun ownership by saying no one is coming for your guns. Well, a community in the People's Republic of California just became the latest faction to prove otherwise. According to Liberty Nation, Santa Clara County is forming what they call a county gun team. That would be a unit of lawyers, analysts, and prosecutors authorized to seek out and confiscate firearms from those the state has deemed should not have them. Says Liberty Nation, and I quote, "The Santa Clara Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to approve funding for the proposal, which was put forth by Board President Cindy Chavez. The team will consist of 7 people, 3 crime analysts, 2 lawyers, and 2 prosecutors. They will be tasked with identifying those who have been ordered to surrender their firearms and ensure these dangerous people aren't still armed, you dangerous person. If necessary, they will obtain search warrants from local law enforcement to go and take the guns." And a rather lengthy prohibited list it is, including those convicted of felony or certain domestic violence crimes, those addicted to narcotic drugs, those convicted of specific crimes, both felony and misdemeanor, involving violence, hate crime offenses, or the unlawful misuse of firearms, those convicted of violating state laws regarding safe storage of firearms around minors and prohibited people. This usually results in a 10-year prohibition in the People's Republic of California. Anyone who knows they are subject to an outstanding arrest warrant for a firearm prohibiting offense, not convicted, simply subject to a warrant. Those prohibited as a condition of probation. Wards of the juvenile courts due to the commission of an offense involving violence, drugs, or firearms. The prohibition remains in effect until age 30. Anyone who knows they are subject to a protective order, restraining order, temporary restraining order, or injunction issued by a court pursuant to state law, including extreme risk protection orders, otherwise known as red flag laws, and anyone prohibited because of a history of mental illness or chronic alcoholism. So, for those of you who routinely rationalize not contacting legislators to express opposition to gun control, and then rationalize it by saying, well, if they come for my guns, they'll get them one bullet at a time, well, let's just say that if the left gets its way, you might get the chance to do just that. Let's see how that works out for you and your family. As you probably know, red flag gun confiscation laws are sweeping across a variety of states, and they confiscate guns from people convicted of nothing. People who might not even know a judicial proceeding is underway to confiscate their guns, much less get a chance to defend themselves in court. Well, thankfully, at least some law enforcement officials see it that way too. In a recent show, we discussed how an obsessed woman in Colorado, whose son had committed what you can only call suicide by cop, actually filed a red flag order against the cop forced to kill her son. Now, a law enforcement periodical called Police One just ran a piece entitled, "The Dangers Posed by Red Flag Laws. Cops and Citizens Could Become Victims of These New Statutes If Due Process and Other Fundamental Liberties Are Violated." The piece goes on to document the history of gun confiscation orders as well as their potential hazards. But among the piece's conclusions are, and I quote, "Without pre-seizure due process, I feel these laws are inherently unconstitutional." Speaking of red flags, how about Chuck Schumer, eh? Not often you hear a senior United States senator physically threaten Supreme Court justices. And physically threaten is exactly what he did. As you probably know, addressing a crowd of angry leftists at a pro-abortion rally right in front of the Supreme Court, Schumer said, and I quote, "I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions." Now, he later tried to backpedal by claiming he was talking about the political consequences to members of the Senate, but no rational person could conclude he was talking to anybody but Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, and no rational person could conclude it was anything other than a threat. Even Chief Justice John Roberts, who rarely responds to political pressure, issued a statement saying, and I quote, "Justices know that criticism comes with the territory, but threatening statements of this sort from the highest levels of government are not only inappropriate, they are dangerous. All members of the court will continue to do their job without fear or favor from whatever quarter." Later, we will discuss the implications of this latest threatened violence from the left, but right now I want to cheer you up a bit. In what might be one of the relatively few valid applications of red flag gun confiscation laws, I'm happy to say that Gun Owners of America has filed for a red flag order against Senator Charles Schumer in Kings County in his home state of New York. Couldn't happen to a more deserving guy. Doubtless, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo will see to it that Schumer gets off scot-free. But don't expect that sort of treatment yourself. Consider, for example, an article from Reason magazine about a case in Florida. And I quote, "Under Florida's recent and widely used red flag gun confiscation law, Kevin Morgan's estranged wife claimed he was depressed, suicidal, and obsessed with the apocalypse, which she said he thought was imminent. She said he was stockpiling food, gold, guns, and ammunition in anticipation of the end of times, that he talked about seeing, hearing, and wrestling with demons. She reported that he was abusing the drugs he had been prescribed for chronic pain, had talked about dismembering his former wife, had intimated he would do the same to her if she ever disrespected him, and had threatened to kill her. On the strength of such claims, Joni Morgan obtained a temporary domestic violence protection injunction, an involuntary psychiatric evaluation order under the Florida Mental Health Act, aka the Baker Act, and a temporary risk protection order under the Red Flag Law. All three were ex parte orders, meaning they were issued without giving Kevin Morgan a chance to rebut the allegations against him. We're going to take a short break. After our break, we will let you know what happened as a result of that red flag order against Kevin Morgan. Meantime, you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. After our short break, we will return with still more information better enabling you to defend your gun rights, including the impact of our recent elections on your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Before our break, we discussed how Gun Owners of America had ironically filed for a red flag gun confiscation order against New York Senator Chuck Schumer over his recent threat against Supreme Court Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. We also talked about a recent hearing or a recent red flag order issued in Florida against Kevin Morgan by his estranged wife, claiming he was suicidal, obsessed with the apocalypse, stockpiling guns and ammunition. Ruh-roh, I guess I might be in trouble, I don't know. Anyways, she'd accused him of abusing drugs and whatnot. And under Florida's laws, she obtained a red flag order in an ex parte hearing, meaning that Morgan did not get a chance to rebut her allegations against him in court. In what is probably one of the few good outcomes, however, but not an outcome without spending tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, I'm sure, when it was time for the judge to decide whether the initial gun confiscation order, which was limited to 14 days, should be extended for a year, Morgan got a hearing, and the lurid picture painted by his wife disintegrated. By the end of the hearing, in an extraordinary turn of events unlike anything you are likely to see in a courtroom drama, the lawyer representing the Citrus County Sheriff's Office, which was seeking the final order, conceded that he had not met the law's evidentiary standard, and the judge agreed. Dismissed. But once again, because the initial or 14-day order was issued in an ex parte hearing without due process of law or adequate due process of law, the man was deprived of his guns for 14 days and forced to spend thousands of dollars to recoup his gun rights. Typical red flag order. This just in from The Truth About Guns. The Trump administration has finalized new rules that loosen export control regulations around small arms, something that has been in the works for a couple of years now. Now, we've written about the topic a number of times here, in Truth About Guns, that is. The new rules would shift various small arms and ammunition from the U.S. munitions list, part of the U.S. Department of State's International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR, to the Commerce Control List, bringing them under the U.S. Department of Commerce's Export Administration Regulations, or EAR, E-A-R. ITAR governs defense-related exports, while the EAR controls dual-use items that can be used for either commercial or military purposes, and has less strict export licensing requirements than the State Department's rules. The new rules also eliminate a punitive annual $2,250 registration fee that gunsmiths and small companies who do not manufacture nor export firearms or ammunition products were forced to pay. The National Shooting Sports Foundation praised the move, saying, and I quote, "This is a tremendous achievement for the firearms and ammunition industry. We salute the Trump administration for modernizing our nation's outdated Cold War-era export controls and putting American manufacturers on an even playing field with their foreign competitors." Now, the latest from the canary in the coal mine with respect to gun rights, namely Virginia. As you recall, last fall, Democrats took control of all branches of Virginia's state government. Although some gun rights advocates have blamed the rout on the influx of migrants from elsewhere, in reality the leftist takeover resulted primarily from two things that we are experiencing right here in North Carolina. First, Eric Holder and his National Democratic Redistricting Committee sued over Virginia's political districts, forcing legislators to draw districts more favorable to Democrats. Next, Michael Bloomberg came in and figured out that he could get more bang for the buck by using his millions in small legislative races rather than the more expensive federal races. Consequently, Democrat Governor Ralph Blackface Northam and the Democrats controlling the legislature introduced a package of gun bans like nothing Virginia has seen before. In response, of course, Virginia gun rights supporters went into open revolt, passing resolutions in support of the Second Amendment in most counties in the state, holding a lobby day demonstration in Richmond that drew, by most accounts, about 30,000 people. When North Carolinians began pushing for a rally in Raleigh, I replied that instead of spending our time and money holding rallies, we should invest our efforts in winning the 2020 elections to avoid becoming Virginia. I pointed out that the problem with rallies is that they are all sound and fury, and when finished, legislatively speaking, nothing has changed. Nevertheless, gun rights supporters cheered when perhaps the worst of the bills, a ban on semi-automatic firearms and magazines, got tabled in Virginia as Democrats in marginal districts refused support. But then I counseled that gun rights supporters were celebrating prematurely. And now, this just in from the Epoch Times, which reports that Northam and Company are pretty much ignoring the massive opposition to gun control and are getting ready to enact 5 gun control measures into law. Says the Epoch Times, and I quote, "A handful of gun control bills have recently been approved by Virginia's General Assembly and will now head to Governor Ralph Northam's desk for signing, despite strong opposition from Second Amendment advocates and gun rights groups." 5 bills, part of a larger group of 8 gun control proposals, also known as the Governor's Package, are expected to be signed by Northam after passage by state legislators. The bills will officially become law with Northam's signature. Among the approved measures are a red flag bill that would allow authorities to temporarily confiscate guns from anyone deemed by a judge to be dangerous to themselves or others, a bill allowing localities to ban guns in certain areas, and a bill penalizing gun owners for not reporting a stolen firearm. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not faulting Virginians for passing Second Amendment resolutions and holding rallies once they lost control of the legislature. In the same position, I would do exactly the same thing here. But, once again, the problem with rallies is that once you are done, nothing has changed. Anti-gun legislators are still free to pass whatever they want. Maybe the gun rights revolution in Virginia will result in changes to the legislature in the next election. Maybe not. Regardless, it is less likely that they will be able to repeal the gun control Northam signs into law. If I have learned one thing in the 26 years I've directed gun rights organizations, it is that once a law is on the books, it is nearly impossible to repeal it. Even the federal ban on so-called assault weapons passed in 1994 was not repealed in 2004. Instead, during its passage, Republicans inserted a sunset into the bill which caused it to expire in 2004. When the bill was about to sunset, Democrats weren't able to muster enough votes to pass it again. And believe me, it wasn't for lack of effort. I was involved in the battle. What most people don't know is that the NRA was quite ready to reenact the semi-auto ban in order to secure the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Firearms Act as part of the bargain. That would have protected gun manufacturers against lawsuits then being filed by cities against gun manufacturers in an attempt to shut them down. It was only by the efforts of a coalition of state and national organizations, of which I'm proud to say Grassroots North Carolina was a member, that we were able to get the NRA to back away from the measure, after which it collapsed. The Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act then passed cleanly in the next session of Congress. So the takeaway is Virginia is indeed the canary in the coal mine, and Virginia's canary is telling us that if we lose the 2020 elections, it's all over. The Democrats in the North Carolina General Assembly have already introduced legislation making it clear what they want. Semi-auto bans, registration of gun transfers, red flag gun confiscation, giving sheriffs discretion to deny any gun purchase they choose, and much, much more. Now, I'm not trying to be partisan here, but it is a fact. If Democrats gain control of the North Carolina legislature and anti-gun Governor Roy Cooper remains in office, they will likely pass all of these things. We won't be able to stop them. And no amount of Second Amendment rallies or sanctuary resolutions will change that. So at any given time, we are one election away from, for all practical intents and purposes, losing our gun rights. As I will discuss in the next segment of our show, I was not impressed what I saw from gun voters in the March 3rd primary election. I don't know exactly what the Republican voter turnout was, but I would guess it was on the order of about 15%. The weekend before Election Day, I was at a USPSA match where I was introduced and gave brief comments to the competitors. The first question I asked was, "How many of you have voted early?" Only a smattering of hands went up. Now, in the next segment, we will discuss the mixed results for gun rights in the 2020 primary elections and what that might mean for the future of gun rights in our state. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. After a short break, we will return with still more critical information enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. The primary elections last week were a mixed bag for gun rights supporters. Beyond the inevitable Trump victory in the Republican presidential primary, you were undoubtedly aware that the biggest threat to the Second Amendment, the presidential bid of billionaire, megalomaniac, and gun ban zealot Michael Bloomberg, is over. As we will see, however, that does not end his plan to spend $60 million to flip the North Carolina legislature to Democrat control in order to push his gun ban agenda. In other good news, however, Second Amendment supporter Dan Forest won the Republican gubernatorial bid and will face incumbent anti-gun Governor Roy Cooper in November. Equally fortunate was the victory of gun rights advocate Mark Robinson in the Republican primary for lieutenant governor. You may recall that Robinson achieved fame for his impassioned presentation to the Greensboro City Council in favor of the right to keep and bear arms when a video of the event went viral. Who Robinson faces on the Democrat side is yet to be determined, pending a runoff election in a race in which no candidate has achieved the required 30% of the vote. Federal races were pretty much as expected, with Thom Tillis winning the Republican primary, meaning he will face anti-gun Democrat Cal Cunningham in November. Elsewhere, Republicans can expect to lose at least 2 congressional seats in November, thanks to redistricting forced upon the legislature by an Obama-appointed judge who deemed our congressional districts to be racist. Unfortunately, the victor for the Democrat primary for District 2, formerly held by Republican George Holding, who elected not to run after the forced redistricting effectively gave his seat to Democrats, that victor was Deborah Ross, who will undoubtedly prevail in November, God help us. You may remember that Ross as the anti-gun Democrat who killed GRNC's Castle Doctrine bill by denying it a hearing on its first run. We later passed it. One other interesting congressional race was the 11th District in western North Carolina, where conservative stalwart Mark Meadows elected not to run for re-election. If you kept track of recent news, you know that Meadows, who had been close to or has been close to Donald Trump, just accepted an appointment to the position of White House Chief of Staff, which will undoubtedly increase not only Meadows' stature, but potentially that of our state. But the real intrigue in the 11th District comes from the 12 Republican candidates vying for the seat in a predominantly Republican district. I live in that district, and let me tell you, that race got ugly. Ugly not just from Republican infighting, but also from an out-of-state false flag operation trying to deprive true conservatives of a voice in not just Congress, but in the Republican Party. We will talk about that more momentarily. Now, in races for the state legislature, outcomes were marginal. Some highlights. On the upside, the most pro-gun member of the North Carolina General Assembly, Representative Larry Pittman, survived yet another primary by party leadership who invariably try to replace him with a centrist they can more easily control. And in North Carolina Senate races, the Republican open seat left by Jim Davis as he ran for Congress in the 11th District will likely be filled in November by pro-gun Republican Kevin Corbin. On the downside, we were unable to defeat anti-gun Republican Sam Watford in Davidson County in his bid for his old House seat. Now, after voting against gun owners in 2017, GRNC was able to defeat Watford when he elected to run for an open Senate seat. This time, however, a third candidate, Haley Sink, possibly running as a deliberate spoiler, split the vote, allowing Watford to defeat pro-gun challenger Roger Younts. And in Catawba County, the Republican primary for the open seat vacated by Andy Wells, who unsuccessfully ran for lieutenant governor, pro-gun former North Carolina House Representative Mark Hollow lost to the party establishment favorite, Dean Proctor. Now, let's talk about the truly Byzantine and Machiavellian tale of deception in a major North Carolina election, specifically the 11th Congressional District, for which, by the way, there will be a runoff election on May 12th. Listen carefully because this gets convoluted. But I want you to hear it as an object lesson in how conservative Republicans seem bound and determined to shoot themselves in the foot. First, allow me to relay a quote from the late Samuel Francis, who was a columnist for the conservative Washington Times. At a Council of Conservative Citizens luncheon in the 1990s, he said, and I quote, "Our political system is anchored by two dominant parties, the stupid party and the evil party, and occasionally, in the spirit of bipartisanship, they produce legislation which is both stupid and evil." Let's talk about stupid party tricks, shall we? As a resident of the 11th District, I bore witness to a record amount of hit mail against conservative candidate Linda Bennett, who was endorsed by both Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan of the Congressional Freedom Caucus, and who ran on the promise that she would follow in Meadows' footsteps and join the caucus. Ironically, the hit mail and TV advertising came from an entity calling itself Fix Congress Now and attacked Bennett for being a never-Trumper. Ignoring for a moment that Bennett had the endorsement of Mark Meadows, one of Trump's closest allies, seems a little odd he would endorse a never-Trumper, don't you think? The source of the hit mail itself was fascinating. It seems that Fix Congress Now is associated with a supposedly centrist organization calling itself Unite America, which has, as its co-chair of its advisors, Representative Carlos Curbelo, Republican of Florida, who, according to the Miami Herald, has been endorsed by none other than Michael Bloomberg's AstroTurf gun ban organization, Everytown for Gun Safety. So, meanwhile, Fix Congress Now paid $277,000 to an outfit called Polestar to do hit mail on Bennett. Oh, did I forget to mention that Unite America, Fix Congress Now, and Polestar all have the same address at 1580 Lincoln Street, Denver, Colorado? Now, do these rhinos and gun control advocates seem like the sort of people that would be concerned about Bennett being a never-Trumper? Of course not. The grand irony here is that the never-Trumper accusations against Bennett were being made by, wait for it, never-Trumpers. So how did a front organization based in Colorado get the idea to bash Bennett as a never-Trumper? Why, from a dissident faction of our own Republicans, specifically a faction split from the Haywood County Republican Party. Having been ejected from GOP events, reportedly for crossing out the names of Republicans they considered to be rhinos from sample Republican ballots, Maybe they were out for revenge against Haywood Party leadership that was reportedly close to Bennett. I don't know. Regardless of motivation, First and Freedom Daily, a blog in North Carolina, documented how these dissidents took a video of Bennett speaking satirically at a GOP meeting about never-Trumpers and doctored the video, taking her comments out of context to make it appear that she was speaking of herself as a never-Trumper. So consider what we have here. Members of the stupid party of Haywood County, North Carolina, unwittingly giving rhinos of the stupid party in Colorado the ammunition to try and defeat a real conservative who vowed to join the Freedom Caucus if elected. But you only begin to understand the true motives of Unite America and its front Fix Congress Now if you look at what they did elsewhere. In California, of all places, they ran a hit campaign against another candidate. And what did this other candidate have in common with Bennett? Both were endorsed by the Freedom Caucus. Remember, the Freedom Caucus is not popular among centrist, read that, liberal Republicans. After all, it was Meadows who deposed Speaker John Boehner. So by giving ammunition to Unite America, a.k.a. Fix Congress Now, the dissidents of North Carolina unwittingly gave ammunition to those attempting to undermine true conservatives within the Republican Party. Oh yes, did I mention that Fix Congress Now also gave money to and did a mailing for another candidate in the race, Dan Driscoll, whom the Asheville Citizen-Times notes didn't even live in the district until recently renting a house in Black Mountain. Now, the theory I'm about to express is probably worth what you're paying for it, but here's what I believe. Unite America might have told Driscoll they wanted him to win, but they really didn't. What they really wanted was the election of Jim Davis. They were using Driscoll as a vote stealer to either defeat Bennett or to force a runoff election. But here's where it gets funny. The rhinos of Unite America got their runoff all right, but since Bennett led the vote but didn't get the required 30%, but they failed to get Davis into the runoff because, ironically, a fresh young face by the name of Madison Cawthorn did a bunch of slick television advertising and placed second behind Bennett. So on May 12th, Western North Carolina will face a runoff between Bennett and Cawthorn. Now, Cawthorn failed to return GRNC's survey the first time, earning only our lowest zero-star evaluation, but we do reissue the survey in each election cycle, so he gets another chance. We will see what happens next. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. After a short break, we will return with more critical information enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Last week, one of my GRNC volunteers forwarded me an interesting study entitled Hidden Tribes, America's Polarized Political Landscape, which hails from an organization calling itself More in Common, which claims a goal of, quote, uniting divided societies. Can't fault the goal. American society is certainly divided. On one level, the report does what mediocre research often does, namely to prove the obvious, albeit with slightly greater nuance. And amusingly, the paper claims, quote, our research uncovered a different story, one that probes underneath the issues that polarize Americans and finds 7 groups that are defined by their core beliefs rather than their political opinions or by their race, class, or gender. Rather than by their political opinions. And it goes on to categorize people by their political opinions. Core belief versus political opinion strikes me as a distinction without a difference. Rather than simply left or right, the study divides America into 7 tribes, ranging from progressive activist, I love that word, on the left side of the spectrum, to devoted conservative on the right. I would argue that there is nothing progressive about the hard left, but we'll save that for later. The paper goes on to profile each of the 7 tribes in terms of beliefs in common issues, such as immigration, sexual harassment, what it calls Islamophobia, a term which itself denotes bias in the study, and, of course, white privilege. Among issues include other issues include Donald Trump, DACA, feminism, and police brutality. One thing I would question is how the tribes were classified, given that they identified what they call passive liberals, but not passive conservatives, instead calling the group moderate. The net effect is to create a false impression of more liberals and fewer conservatives. Ironically, on the same day my volunteer forwarded the study, I encountered an Epoch Times article entitled, quote, Sanders Field Organizer Advocates Violent Revolution, Gulags for Trump Supporters, Liberals in Undercover Videos. I realized that I was a bit late in picking up an undercover video just released by my friend James O'Keefe of Project Veritas. You might recall that Project Veritas was the group whose undercover videos pretty much took out the Barack Obama love fest calling itself Acorn. Or, more recently, you might recall the secret video of a CNN anchor discussing, actually complaining about how her network buried her story about Hollywood leftists and their sexual abuse. Well, on Project Veritas's latest secret video, they lovingly detail the plans of Kyle Jurek, an Iowa field organizer, that's an employee, for Democratic presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders. In the video, Jurek details the plans of the hard left, the progressive activists, and what they have in mind. That in just a moment. Among the conclusions from the Hidden Tribes paper, you should consider the following. To a greater extent than any other group, the hard left, there I go again, I meant progressive activists, defines itself by its political ideology. In other words, to a greater extent than devoted conservatives, leftists consider their leftism to be central to their being, by 64 to 52% to be exact. Here's one that won't surprise you. To a greater extent than any other group, especially conservatives, leftists report, quote, feeling the most pressure from individuals of their own political ideology to conform to that ideology. Well, that demonstrates what you probably already knew. Leftists are herd animals who are quite willing to cull out any non-conforming members of the herd. Perhaps the most obvious example of that is the social media cancel culture, which recently ejected actor Vince Vaughn for having the audacity to shake hands with President Trump. Another conclusion that won't surprise you is that leftists are almost twice as likely as conservatives to protect, that's their word, protect people from dangerous and hateful speech by a factor of 74 to 43%. Well, here, by the way, it's unfortunate that the authors combined dangerous and hateful categories of speech into one, since they're very different things. I suspect that on hateful speech alone, the divide between left and right would be far greater. But more alarming, the hard left comprises fully 8% of our population. But before you say that's not many, I urge you to imagine that one of every 12 people you meet might be happy to see you in a gulag. And, says the paper, quote, they have an outsized role in political discourse even though they comprise a small portion of the total population. Here are some tidbits about the hard left, compared to average mainstream Americans. They are more than twice as likely to list politics as their hobby, 73 to 35%. 3 times more likely to say that people's outcomes are the result of luck and circumstance, 75 to 25%. More than twice as likely to say that they never pray, 50 to 19%. More than 3 times more likely to be ashamed to be an American, 69 to 24%. And more likely to say they are proud of their political ideology, 63 to 46%. Meaning they're proud to be ashamed to be an American, I guess. The paper also has some things to say about devoted conservatives, which comprise the counterpart to progressive activists. Many have to do with conservative beliefs, none of which will surprise you. I'll skip those. But how about this? Only 6% of the population identify as devoted conservatives, as opposed to 8% who are progressive activists. At first blush, that might not sound like much of a difference until you consider that it means of the people who politically get things done, the leftists outnumber us by 33%. Now, I won't dispute how the paper characterizes what different groups espouse and support or what issues divide us. What the paper does not do, however, is to theorize why. For example, the authors note that the hard left does not feel its core values and identity to be threatened, but by a factor of 5, traditional conservatives do. Why? I would offer that it is because the hard left is the undermining and destroying force in traditional values. But of course, that's my opinion. The study is silent. More importantly, why are we so divided? I would posit that the answer lies in the inaccuracy of the progressive activist portrayed in the study. They profile the typical leftist as Keene, a late middle-aged attorney living in Indiana close to his family. Nonsense. The real hard left activist is more likely portrayed by Kyle Jurek, the Iowa field organizer for Democratic presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders. Here are some of the beliefs this progressive activist and employee of a major presidential campaign freely espoused, and by and large, these are verbatim quotes. Quote, "The only thing fascists, that would be you, understand is violence. So the only way you can confront them is with violence. If Trump is elected, cities will burn. They, that would be Trump supporters, are effing scared senseless by anti-fascists. If Bernie doesn't get the nomination, or it goes to a second round at the Democratic National Convention, effing Milwaukee will burn." Jurek also wants the violence of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, but doesn't know it was 1968, saying repeatedly it was 1978, and he also got the candidates wrong, but after all, when have you ever encountered a leftist who would let a few facts stand in the way of his opinions? Here's another. The cops are the ones that are going to get effing beaten in Milwaukee. They're going to have to call up the National Guard for that expletive. Or, I don't give a F if it's free speech or not. You don't need, like, free speech has repercussions. Yeah, there are consequences to your speech. By the way, Jurek thinks your free speech is calling for the elimination of people based on race and gender, adding that you deserve a violent reaction. But if the hard left gets its way, the 26% of our population, who the paper describes as traditional liberals or passive liberals, are in for a rude surprise. It isn't just conservatives that Jurek and his ilk want to kill, and I quote, "Liberals get the wall first," end quote. Even the left-wing media isn't leftist enough for them. Jurek wants to walk into the even MSNBC studio and, quote, "drag those MFs by their hair and light them on fire in the streets." Yeah, in case you missed it, light them on fire in the streets. In perhaps the greatest lack of self-irony, this violent sociopath hired by the Bernie Sanders campaign says something we can all agree on. And I quote, "Bernie is a bad judge of character." You think? My name is Paul Ballone. You have been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com, where each Sunday at 5 p.m. as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your right to keep and bear arms. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, at HyattGuns.com. I also encourage you to check my website at GunsPoliticsAndFreedom.com, spell out the and, GunsPoliticsAndFreedom.com, where you can find both my writings and earlier editions of the show. See you next Sunday at 5.